Is my mic on? You can or you can't? Can everybody hear me okay? Coming through the live stream all right? What? Oh. Let me pull this up. Say hello to everybody online. Everybody joining us through the live stream. I hope that you all came ready this morning. If last week was any indicator of how the rest of the Sunday school series is going to go, it's going to be a thick, thick day. I'm excited. It's going to be really good. Give everybody just a couple minutes to get signed on. We didn't get this mic working, did we? That's okay. Well, if you guys have questions or comments at some point throughout Sunday school today, if you'd be willing to come up and speak into one of our mics so everybody online can hear you, that would be fantastic. Because I want people to be able to hear what you guys have to say and what you're thinking. And if you're joining us online, I've also got you pulled up on my phone right here. You get to join me right up front in the very front row. So I'm excited. I'm really excited for today, because today we get into the heart and the meat of the book of Job. Today is the day where if you don't like poetry, then today's going to be rough for you. Because the rest of Job, until we get to chapter 40 really, is all poetry. And so we're going to dive into some of this poetry. We're going to talk a little bit about the structure of the poem and how the poem is trying to get us to think along certain lines. I'm going to propose an interpretation to you, and we're going to see where we land with it today, because as I talked about a couple of weeks ago, up to this point in the story in Job chapter 1 and 2, we've seen Job's patience, maybe, though I would debate that a little bit as you get to the end of chapter 2. But really here in chapter 3, we start to get into, we start to get into the strong lament, and there's really big questions that are addressed here. So we'll get into that, and again, if you're online and you have questions, please feel free to type those into the chat or to say hi or anything like that. We're going to do a short time of prayer this morning, and so if you're online and you have prayer requests, we would love to pray with you this morning as well. But while people online maybe are typing things in the chat or are getting things ready, does anybody in the room have prayer requests, things that you would like prayed for this morning? All right, for Bob's daughter and her family, we will be praying for them. Which daughter, Bob? Which one?
My younger daughter.
Younger one. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, tax season is upon us once again. My grandpa used to be a CPA. He retired a few years ago. But he always said we were not allowed to have birthdays or anything during tax season. And then my mom proceeded to be born on April 11th. So there's that. Anybody else? All right. Well, asking for prayer requests and hearing no others, let's go ahead and spend a moment in prayer together this morning, and then we'll dive back into the book of Job. Lord Jesus, we come before you this morning. We are grateful to have been brought here for another week. I'm grateful for those who are able to be here in person. I'm grateful for the technology that allows us to be available all over the country and indeed all over the world. And just for the way that you are using the branch in various ways in various communities. We we thank you for allowing us to partner with you in building for your kingdom here. God, as we prepare to approach the scriptures this morning, we choose now to lay our cares and our burdens down before you. God, we lift up Bob's youngest daughter living in Georgia. We ask that you pour out blessings on their family, that whatever is going on with them, that your presence is tangible with them, that it is felt strongly by them, that you bring peace and comfort into their lives, and be with Bob and Lisa as well as they figure out the dynamics of being supportive from a distance. Lord, we also lift up those who are preparing their taxes, who are getting ready to go through the potentially arduous process. Would you be with all of us as we take those steps? Would you help us to have peace through the situation? Would you bring us out on the other side unscathed? And God, we lift up this time to you. We lift up this morning to you, especially, Lord, as we reflect on this last year. We reflect on this COVID world, this COVID situation that has been brought upon us. And God, as we cry out to you this morning, I pray that you hear our cries, that you remember your people, and that you turn and you deliver us from this. We are ready. We are here. We are going to continue to wrestle and struggle through this. But God, we choose this morning to lean on you and to trust in you. So we pray that you're with us now as we dive into the scriptures and as we look at a poem that is very significant for lament. Thank you for this time. We love you. We pray all this in your name. Amen. Yes, good to see you this morning, Tara. It is an hour earlier this morning. Yeah, it's always fun. This is just a really quick little random thing, and then we'll get into Job. I've found that, as I've grown up, because, I grew up in the 90s before we had big fancy cell phones and, automatic digital clocks that, hooked up to the atomic clock satellite in the sky or whatever. And so I remember, trying to figure out when did I have to set my clock forward and when did I have to set my clock back. But now, everything is so automated that, I think the only clocks that don't change themselves are the one in my car, which, I could get to update itself, but I don't want to go through all that hassle. And then, any analog clock I have in my house, but, my alarm clock, my cell phone, my watch even, if you have a digital watch, all those things just update automatically. And so I feel like we're spoiled with that. I don't know. That seems like a really weird thing to be spoiled with, but I'm thankful for automatic clocks that update themselves, so I don't have to worry about it. That's great. And good morning to Emily, and I hope John is with you this morning too. It's good to have you guys with us here. All right, well let's dive back on into the strange and complex world of the book of Job. And as you'll remember last week, there were a couple of questions that the end of chapter 2 left us with. And I wanted to just reiterate these questions because a lot of these questions are going to be present throughout the whole book, especially as we start diving into the poetry of it. These themes just keep popping up in one way or another, and so it's good to have these questions in the back of your mind as we continue to read through these. So the big questions that we talked about last week, there were 4 of them. The first one is the human relationship with God primarily utilitarian? That means, is the human relationship with God primarily to get something? What if the consequence of that relationship is suffering and not blessing? So what is the purpose of the human-divine relationship? And then a question that's related to that, but I think is slightly different, is do people worship God simply because God is God, or do people worship only when and because God is good? And how we understand what good is. Question number 3, what if God is as arbitrary and vulnerable as the experience of Job suggests? Does that make God any less God? And then question 4, what is inside of the human heart as opposed to what humans may say or do, and what are the human convictions in the face of a God who does not meet common expectations. And this last question, I think, what's inside of the human heart and, what are human convictions in the face of a God who doesn't meet their expectations? This is going to be a hugely important question as we get into Job chapter 3. Because as you'll remember, one thing that we looked at and one of the questions that the adversary raises, and if you want to know more about the adversary, I encourage you to go watch last week because we talked about the adversary. Not at length, but we talked about it enough where it's like, okay, we have a good sense of what the adversary is. But one of the really important questions that the adversary raises is, will Job bless God to the face? Right? And you remember, bless here is sort of used as a euphemism in chapters 1 and 2, where it's the word for bless, but it really means curse, and our English translations kind of betray us because they immediately just translate it as curse, but we miss the nuance of blessing and cursing. But then what's really interesting is in chapter 3, verse 1, which we're going to read through chapter 3 here in just a second. In chapter 3, verse 1, you get the word curse, and this is the actual Hebrew word for curse, when Job curses his day. And so immediately in our minds, again, we have to wonder, okay, Job is cursing his day. What does this mean that he's is he cursing it in the sense of he's blessing it? Is he cursing it in the sense that he's cursing it? What is the actual dynamic here between these blessing and these curses? But the whole framework of this poem, and one of the really important questions that we're going to have to look at is, will Job bless God to the face? Is Job going to just outright, throw blessings at God right in the face? One other interesting thing to note as we move into chapter 3, this is what some translators and some commentators have called Job's third test. If you'll remember last week, we talked about how the scenes in Job 1 and 2 shift between the reality on earth and the reality in the heavenly realm, and then the reality on earth and then reality in the heavenly realm. And every time the scene shifts from the divine realm to the human realm, there's a test for Job inside of the human realm. And so the first scene, we get Job and we get the description. The second scene, we get the divine counsel. And the third scene, we get Job's first test where all his possessions and family is taken from him. And then you get a second divine counsel. And then you get Job's second test, which, is Job's body is afflicted with diseases and with all of these things. And then there's a third meeting, there's a third council, but this time the council doesn't take place in heaven. This time the council is with Job and Job's friends, and they all meet together, and the end of chapter 2 says that they just sit together, and Job's wife is, just curse God, and Job is like, no, I'm not going to do that. But we have this third council, and so right after the council, as readers, we're saying, okay, we are expecting another test for Job. And so you could potentially read Job 3 really onward as Job's third test. Or, again, this question, will Job bless God to the face? Is Job going to just outright throw these things back in God's face? And so these help set the stage for what we're going to look at. Now, one other really important note. I know I said that last time, but one other really important note before we dive in. Job chapter 3 is extremely dense and complex Hebrew poetry. It's beautiful and it's wonderful, and what I hope to do today as we look through it is I want to help unravel some of the mysteries and some of the connections. But I also want to just say this at the beginning. There's no possible way that we're going to get through all of it. Because just chapter 3 itself is 26 verses, and we're going to spend, 5 to 10 minutes on one verse, maybe. And so just because of the way that time is laid out before us in the Sunday school class, we're not going to have time to go through all of it. But I encourage you this week, if there's something that strikes a chord with you, or if as I'm reading through it this first time, you see something that I don't touch on, spend time with it this week and sit with it and wrestle with it. My biblical poetry professor this semester, he said to us a number of times now that biblical poetry is great because it's like playing a video game. So you have biblical narrative is cool because it's like a photograph, but biblical poetry is cool because it's like a video game where you have to interact with it and you have to play with it and mess with it in order to get out all of the meaning But poetry is meant to be interactive. It's meant to engage with you in a way that narrative and that discourse just don't. And so I encourage you to wrestle with this and make connections to, other pieces of the poetry, or make connections to other pieces of the Bible, or if you have training in this, or even if you don't have training in this, make connections to other points of ancient Near Eastern literature, which is what we're going to do today. Because again, a lot of these parallels come out and you start to see some really, really cool things. So with all of that in mind, let's turn now to the words of Job himself inside of his lament. Job chapter 3. Afterwards, after all the things happened in chapters 1 and 2, afterwards Job opened his mouth and cursed his day. And Job responded and said, "Perish the day when I was born, the night that said mortal is conceived. That day, let there be darkness. Let God above not seek it. Let no light shine over it. Let darkness and pall redeem it. Let a cloud settle over it. Let them terrify it like the bitterness of day. That night, let gloom take it away. Let it not be included among the days of the year. Let it not come into the reckoning of months. Lo, let that night, let it be unfruitful. Let jubilation not come in it. Let the enchanters of day curse it, the ones who are skilled to rouse Leviathan. Let its twilight stars darken. Let one hope for light, but there be none. Let it not see the eyes of dawn. For one did not shut the doors of my belly, nor hide misery from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth, or go forth from the belly and expire? Why did knees meet me, and what are breasts that I should have suckled? Surely now I would be lying down and quiet. I would be asleep, and then there will be rest for me. With the kings and viziers of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes for whom there is gold, who fill their abodes with silver. Or like a hidden stillborn, I would be not, like infants that have never seen light. There the wicked cease trouble, and those weary of power rest. Captives are together at ease. They do not hear the voice of the oppressor. Small or great, one is there. Yea, the servant is free from his Lord. Why has one given light to the miserable, and life to those who partake of bitterness? Those who yearn for death, but it does not come, dig for it among the buried things. Those who rejoice at the heap, who are glad when they find the grave, for a person whose way is hidden and whom God has shut in. For before my food comes my groaning, poured out as the waters are my roarings. For I had dreaded a dread, and it has come upon me. That of which I have been afraid has happened to me. I am not at ease and not at peace, and I am not at rest. And there comes turmoil. It's a pretty heavy poem, and for the whole like Jesus is my friend sort of evangelicalism that I grew up inside of. This is a hard pill to swallow, because this is a real cry out and a real wrestling, and I hope that as you'll see as we move further on, like these are genuine expressions of someone who is in pain and is in suffering. So Job 3, the big picture of it, first and foremost is a lament, which you probably picked up on. Though when you look through this lament, especially as you compare it to other biblical laments, it's slightly different from other biblical laments because it's missing a couple of key characteristics. The first key characteristic that this lament is missing as opposed to other biblical laments is there's no address to a deity of any kind, but specifically to the God of Israel. There's no specific address. And so like when you go and you read through Lamentations, or you read through, over a third of the Psalms, which are lament Psalms, you'll see inside of those that they are all addressed to the God of Israel, and they're all saying, we live inside of covenant, and you're supposed to be our God, like we're suffering, and so we're addressing this lament to you. And a lot of times they're even calling out to God, and they're saying, this is your fault, why did you do this to us? So we're missing the address to the deity here. But there's also, inside of this, there is no accusation or there's no complaint about enemies. And again, this is something that's really weird, and if you go and you read through the laments, or again, even the Psalms, you'll see a lot of times that the person who's crying out, they're crying out because of their enemies, and they're saying, my enemies have afflicted me. Those who wish to do me harm have continued to like crush me and press in on me, and I need deliverance from these things that are afflicting him. You really just kind of see him throwing his hands up and accepting it and saying like, all right, this is it, I guess. And so this is a really weird biblical lament, because you're missing these two really important features. There are, however, similar features with other ancient Near Eastern laments, particularly the cursing of like a specific day. You see that happen inside of other ancient Near Eastern pieces of literature where the person who is lamenting, where they curse a specific day, usually in the past, and they say, oh, that this day would not have happened, this horrible day where the city burned down, or, where we were conquered and we were taken over by this group of people. If only this day hadn't happened, then everything would be okay from that. And so there are good reasons to think that this kind of language is common inside of this. Again, there are examples. So, for example, you have the Babylonian flood story known as, and I'm going to butcher this, and I apologize for anybody who knows ancient Akkadian. But the Babylonian flood story known as Atrahasis. There's a lament inside of there where the divine council brings on like a deluge, and they flood the earth, and there's crying out from the people, and they say, if only that day hadn't happened, we wish that day had just been removed from the calendar completely. And so there's good reason to think that, yes, this is a lament, but it's a lament that's slightly different from the biblical ones. But then when you move into the poem itself, there are a couple of things about its structure that I think really speak volumes to us. This is a poem that is given to us in two movements. The first movement that you have is movement 3, or the movement from verse 3 through verse 10. And this is you can kind of see it if you start looking at it. But movement 1 from verse 3 to verse 10 it's a malediction, or it's a curse, and it's specifically against night and day. And so you'll see night and day pop up in verses 3 through 10, but you won't see them pop up in verses 11 through 24. They stop showing up there. And so there's a potential connection there where when we're reading it and Job is talking about cursing this day and cursing this night, and then they don't show up in the second half, it's as though Job is crying out, assuming that day and night have now been taken care of and gotten rid of, and yet Job is still afflicted. Like the poetic structure of this first movement sort of breaks down in the second movement, where there's no real good way to like grasp onto a structure inside of the second movement. So you have that. There are also parallels that you can see in verse 20 or in verse 13 and in verse 26. You have verbs like to be quiet, and so there's this sense of in the second movement you have Job is wishing for things to be quiet. Job is wishing for things to be at peace, and then the last two verses are what I'm going to call a poetic coda at the very end, just kind of like a little tack on to help keep the poetic verse intact. But you have the parallel there where Job is saying, I'm not quiet, I'm not peace, I'm not at rest, even though this is what I'm wishing for, even though this is what I'm asking for. And so seeing the poem in these two movements helps us to get a little bit at what Job is saying, because as heavy as the poem already is, when you start looking at the structure and we start going over some of the details with a fine-tooth comb, you start to see that Job is not just simply wishing that the day that he was born never be, or the night that he was conceived never be, but Job, in fact, seems to be pointing beyond that and seems to be hearkening all the way back to creation itself, and seems to be saying that day that you started out by creating everything, let that day never have come to pass. And again, you start to get this in some of the poetry. So we're going to dig into this first movement for a few minutes here, because I want to really bring this out to you, this really strong language that this poem is using. So in your first movement, verses 3 through 10, you have a couplet that introduces the object of Job's curse, right? Verse 3, let the day perish in which I was born, and the night that said, a child is conceived. Yeah, or mortal is conceived. And so the poem starts with this couplet. It also ends with a couplet, and framed by these two couplets are stanzas that have a mixture of 4 triplets and 2 more couplets. There could be something significant with that. Again, I don't want to get too deep into like poetic structure, but the framing of the stanzas by the couplets I think is important for marking the specific section out. However, when you look at the 2 stanzas that are framed by these couplets, you will notice that the first stanza deals specifically with the first part of the first couplet. So the first stanza deals with day, and the second stanza deals with night. And so Job specifically, in very poetic fashion, is saying, curse the day, and then curse the night, and then proceeds to give us a full stanza, a poetic stanza about cursing the day, and then gives us a full poetic stanza about cursing the night. And then you get a third right after those that wish for cosmic darkness, that wish for cosmic chaos. And so again, you see Job, he starts taking this language and he starts pushing not just the day of his birth, but he starts pushing this all the way back to creation. And maybe reading the very first part of verse 4, I think for me is what starts getting my mind thinking like this. Verse 4, that very first line, it says, that day let there be darkness. And I think this is a really important line to sit with, right? Because if you are an avid Bible reader, or if you've opened up the Bible to the very first page, when you go and you look at it, Genesis chapter 1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And then God said, let there be light. And there was. And now Job here is doing a complete reversal of that. At the very beginning of his curse, he says, that day, not just the day that I was born, but now even pushing it back even further, pushing it back all the way to the creation. Instead of let there be light, let there be darkness. Let creation itself be reversed. Let there be darkness. In addition to that, inside of verses 3 through 10, you have 7 invectives, or 7 curses, or 7 like really harsh words that are given before the reason for those words in verse 10. And if you'll remember, the number 7 is really, really important inside of the creation story, for God said 7 things, and those 7 things happened in 7 days, and the 7 days usually represent the totality of creation. And so Job's 7 invectives, Job's 7 really strong words, they are asking for, again, poetically and inside of the structure, they're saying, let creation itself be undone. Where God said it is good, let it be not good. Let it just not even be. Let these things all be gone. Let there be darkness instead of light. You'll also maybe notice there's a parallel here between Job's calling out and cursing of his day of birth with Jeremiah. The prophet Jeremiah also has a curse of his day of birth in Jeremiah chapter 20, verses 14 through 18. And so this is not something that's like only happens in the book of Job. You see people that are cursing the day of their birth as well. I want to say that Jeremiah chapter 20. Um, oh gosh. Yeah. I'm not sure. If anybody knows where Jeremiah chapter 20, I didn't take a huge look at Jeremiah chapter 20. I just checked to make sure that it was actually there. It is there. Yeah. Yeah, look it up and let me know what you find. Because there is a parallel there with that. But so going back to Job cursing the day of his birth, but even pushing beyond the day of his birth, going back to the origin of humanity, going back to even creation itself. You'll notice that there are a couple of other really interesting word choices that the poet here uses. So specifically the word that day is like, it's a super specific phrase, but it is also a phrase that is very evocative in the mind of the biblical reader. And so that day could refer to the day of Job's birth. It could also refer to that day being the day that creation got started. But it could also be in conjunction with the prophetic tradition. It could be that day as in talking about the day of the Lord, talking about the day of judgment and the day when darkness will come and will be brought on creation again. And so Job could be here in a sense, and I think very likely here in a sense, in wishing for not only the day of his birth to not have happened, not only the day of creation to not have happened, is saying like, God, just hurry up and bring on the day of the Lord. Hurry up and bring on the day of judgment, because honestly, I'm kind of sick and tired of all of this. So bring on the darkness, bring on the judgment, bring on the hellfire and the brimstone. Right? I'm ready for it. I'm ready for my life to be taken from me. So Job, again, he's here, he's wishing for darkness. He's wishing for these things to come undone. A couple of other really interesting notes that I really liked. In verse 5, you have these two characters, or these two words that show up. The version that I read is darkness and Paul, P-A-L-L, not P-A-U-L. You could also read it as like gloom and deep darkness. You can read it as that as well. And this gloom and this deep darkness in ancient Near Eastern creation myths, the doom and the deep darkness, these are the things out of which day was birthed. And like doom and Paul, or like darkness and Paul itself, actually gave birth to day, to like daylight. In some of these ancient Near Eastern myths. And so when you read this, reading it from an ancient Near Eastern mind, you come to verse 5, let gloom and darkness claim it, or let darkness and Paul redeem it. And so there's something very interesting here. If Job here, again, because we're in this first part of the movement, this first part of the first movement, where Job is talking specifically about his day, or the day in general, that it is probably referring back to the day. And so Job here seems to be asking that darkness and gloom and the things that birthed forth day, let them reclaim it. Let them actually fulfill the action of God. And instead of letting God redeem the day, instead of letting God keep and protect the day, let darkness and gloom take it back. Let them take their child back with them, right? Like let daytime itself just be gone and be done with. And again, God here is sort of not explicitly, but implicitly is asked to like forego God's own keeping and God's own protecting of the day. In addition to that, you have our very first mention here of this great beast called Leviathan. This is a super interesting creature to look at. He is absolutely no joke. You'll see Leviathan pop up in a couple of other places later. Specifically, they really famously pop up in chapter 38 or 39. It might even be 40. It's one of the last ones where God is talking to Job. And he's saying, do you see Behemoth and do you see Leviathan? He brings these up while he's talking to Job. But Leviathan here actually serves a different purpose. Job is crying out to these people here in verse 8. Let those who curse it, curse the sea, or let the enchanters of day curse it, depending on how you want to translate that. But these ones who are skilled to rouse Leviathan, the ones who are skilled to like wake up and cause Leviathan to move. And I think there's something really interesting here that we need to look at. So Leviathan is probably first and foremost known in the ancient Near East as the chaos monster of darkness. Leviathan is a big, bad, scary snake monster that basically every single day in some traditions, I'm thinking Egyptian traditions specifically, Leviathan every single day needs to be defeated in order that the sun may make another cycle. And so you have Egyptian pictures and Egyptian hieroglyphics of the sun god Ra riding on his boat, and his attendants have like these giant spears and they're stabbing Leviathan in the face because they're like, we have to defeat Leviathan in order that the sun may show up again the next day. And naturally humans have a part to play in that because, we have a part to play in everything. And so Job here is calling for these people who give offerings, or these people who make these magic incantations, the people who, call for Leviathan to be quelled or to be brought down. Let them instead rouse Leviathan. Let them instead, make Leviathan spring forth. Let them empower Leviathan so that he might overtake day itself. Let the next day just not come, is what Job here seems to be saying. Again, in an incredibly poetic fashion. Let the great chaos monster run free, because I don't even want to see the next day. And again, this is a huge invective against God himself. This is saying this great chaos monster, this thing that is, might be a part of creation somehow, but, still needs to be brought down so that way the day can be brought forth. Like, let's just let everything unravel. Let's just let it all be done with. I'm sick and I'm tired and I'm ready to just, not even just die, though he is ready to die. Like, I'm ready to go beyond dying. I'm ready to just ceasing existing. Like, I'm just, no more. Like, just take me off of this. One other really interesting thing to note in this first movement, and then I want to just look very briefly at the second movement. But you seem to have here divine complicity, or you seem to have Job starting to call God out here in verse 10, right at the very end of this lament. The NRSV reads, "Because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb and hide trouble from my eyes." The other translation that I read, "For one did not shut the doors of my belly nor hide misery from my eyes." This pronoun here specifically, it's hard in Hebrew to translate whether you're talking about it being the day or the it being the night, or even the it being like, the sea or whatever it is that's causing, that would cause people to be shut inside. But the Hebrew pronouns can also refer to people. So in the same way that you refer to it, you also refer to he. And this is a masculine pronoun, and so it has to be referring to something masculine. But what's interesting about this specific verse is that generally, and again throughout the rest of the biblical literature, you see that often God is the one who is credited with opening and closing wombs. And so you see it in Samuel, you see it in a story like Abraham and Sarah, right? Throughout the biblical narrative, you see God as being the one credited for opening the womb. And so Job here is saying, let all of these things happen because God did not shut the doors of my mother's womb. And again, when I'm offering these different interpretations here, this is all poetic engagement, because on the one hand it means it, on the other hand it also means God, and the poetic ambiguity is here on purpose. It's here to force you to engage with it and to wrestle with it. Because again, if you'll remember all the way back, we're looking here, one of the big questions, that's in the mind of in our minds right now as we're reading through this, but in the mind of all readers, is Job going to curse God directly to his face? And right here, it seems like, well, Job isn't like cursing God directly to his face. He doesn't say like, God, this is all your fault, you evil, evil deity, you. But he does sort of seem to kind of implicitly be implying it, right? God is the only one that opens and shuts the womb. God is the one who keeps Leviathan quelled. God is the one who said, let there be light, and now Job is saying, let there be darkness. Like, there really seems to be some stabs taken here at the God of the universe. But Job never, explicitly curses God to the face.
It almost sounds like there's a subtle suggestion to God that he needs a do-over.
Yes, yeah, there is definitely a subtle suggestion to God, again, in some of these undertones, and Job gets more explicit as we go through the book, but there are some subtle undertones that not even does Job need a do-over, but that God needs to stand up and start doing his job. God needs to actually start ruling the universe as he's supposed to. Because, again, one of the underlying assumptions that you'll remember when we watched the Bible Project video a couple weeks ago, one of the underlying assumptions is that God runs the world on the principle of justice. But Job here is experiencing something that we as readers know is 100% unjust, 100% unfair, should not happen to him in any way, shape, or form. And Job knows this. His friends don't know it. And as you'll see as we continue further on, his friends are trying to square this with themselves, but Job is crying out here in what seems to be a very reasonable manner. He's saying, I shouldn't be suffering. I didn't do anything. So if this is how the world works, if this is how things are going to be, let there be darkness instead of light. Let the great chaos monster come and let's just be done with all of this, right? Because you, this one who is supposed to open and shut the mother's womb, you forced me to be born in this world, and I just don't even want to be a part of it anymore. And so this is what Job says through the first movement. This is the first half of chapter 3. And so just some quick notes on the second movement because we're running out of time, and I want to give you guys some stuff to think about as we end. But inside of the second movement, we continue with Job's massive lament. And Job specifically, again, he's looking for death. He's looking for things to be undone. One of the things that really stuck out in my mind was verse 21. All those people who long for death, but it doesn't come, let them dig for it more than for hidden treasures. Right? I'm longing for death, but because I'm not finding it, I'm now going to seek it out as though I'm digging for hidden treasures. This is really scary language. This is really, really hard language to hear, because if somebody were to come into this church right now and were to say this for me, I'm longing for death to the point that I'm going to seek it more than digging for buried treasure, I would be extremely concerned with this person's mental state. I would probably call some kind of counselor or some hospital or something and say, this person seems to be suicidal. This is not a healthy place, in my mind, for Job to be speaking this out of. Because this is really strong, really powerful. Job wants death more than anything else at this point. You also have, in verse 23, one other thing that stuck out to me, verse 23a, there's this idiom of a hidden way. Let me read this other translation. For a person whose way is hidden and whom God is shut in, there's a suggestion here that at issue is the deity's neglect or God's neglect of Job's welfare. He's saying my way has been hidden, but even more than my way being hidden, God has shut me in. And if you'll remember back to last week when we were talking, one of the accusations of God, not just of Job, but of God, is that, God, you only give blessings so that people won't disobey you, and so you hedge them in with all of these different blessings, and then you don't let them escape. And so Job here seems to be using a similar kind of argument and a similar kind of metaphor. You see the same sort of hidden way talk in Isaiah chapter 40, where Isaiah at that point talks about, the way is hidden, but the prophet calls for the sufferer to be patient and to just wait, and says, your suffering is happening, but don't worry, God is protecting you, God is watching out over you. But Job here twists that a little bit, and Job says something different. Job speaks of God's acts as confinement, as saying, God has hedged me in, God has trapped me, and now I can't go anywhere else. And so Job sees God shutting not as protection, but as confinement. And so those are a couple little things that I wanted to point out that really stuck out to me in that second movement. And then just one quick note on the ending coda, the last two verses. The poem ends with allusions to these unspecified fears, right? A translation that I read for you said, I had dreaded a dread. The NRSV says, truly the thing that I fear. And it's like, okay, there's sort of these unspecified fears. We know that Job had really cared about his children. And so, he could have been fearing for his children, but now his children are gone. And so there's a lot of interpretive work and there's a lot of reading into the text that we have to do to really see what Job is talking about with these fears. But the poem ends with these allusions to these unspecified fears. There are also three negatives that are given that are standing in contrast to the respite of death, right? I'm not at ease, I'm not at peace, and I'm not at rest. Whereas if I were just dead, if the creation itself were just undone, if all things were just to be darkness instead of light, I would finally be at ease, I would finally be at rest, and I would finally be at peace. And then the poem ends with this fantastic line that I think as a reader, if we're slowly reading through the poem carefully, it forces us into Job's situation a little bit, because he says, I'm not at ease, I'm not at peace, I'm not at rest. And there comes turmoil. And the poem's last word to us doesn't provide closure. It doesn't provide a sense of, everything's wrapped up in a nice, neat little bow, but rather the poem ends on a chaotic, crazy note. It ends in turmoil, and we as the readers engaging with this poem are left with the same. I'm not at ease, I'm not at rest, I'm not at peace, I'm in turmoil. I'm here just inside of this chaotic mess. So what questions are raised from this poem? What are some things that we can look at and we can start to think about as hopefully you engage with this poem the rest of the week? Well, here are some questions that I think are helpful. Number one, we have to answer our first question. Does Job curse God? And I want to just leave that as like a does Job curse God period. Because on the one hand, does Job curse God to the face, like directly? Not really. But does Job curse God internally? Is there some kind of implicit cursing of God that is happening? I would say probably. I can't say with a definitive like yes, 100%, because even the things that I have given to you are interpretive. And again, that's one of the beautiful things about poetry is when you read it, there are multivalent meanings there. But this is a question for you as the reader now to dialogue with. Does Job curse God? A second question that goes along with that, can we really know what goes on inside of the human heart? And if you remember, again, this is a question that I asked last week because we saw Job explicitly out making sacrifices for his children, explicitly doing all these really great pious things, but on the inside, we don't really know what Job is thinking or what's going on with that unless the narrator has chosen to give us little bits and pieces of information, but ultimately we don't know what's going on inside of Job's head. And again, at the end of the narrative in chapter 2, you'll remember that it ended with that really strange phrase, and in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And it's like, okay, if Job didn't sin with his lips, did he sin with something else? Did he sin with his heart? Did he sin with his soul? Did Job sin with something else? And so the question is, can we know what goes on inside of the human heart? Can we know what happens when people's convictions are met with a God who doesn't meet their expectations? And then the third question is, what do we do with language like this in the midst of suffering? Or maybe a better question to pose to a church is, how would you respond to somebody who came in and started talking like this? Because this is not something that's easy to hear. It's not something that is, fun or that, we have a quick answer to. But, this is something that people deal with and that people struggle with. And one of the hardest things for Christians to answer, in my mind, is why is there suffering? Why do people go through suffering? and hard times? I don't think there's an easy answer. I don't know if there even is an answer that we have. But what do we do with language like this in the midst of suffering? And as a sub-question to that, is there a need for us to step in and defend God? If somebody comes into our church and says, your God isn't good, your God is evil. Your God didn't create things out of goodness, your God created things out of wickedness in order to just spite creation. Let that day be completely and totally undone. Do we feel like we need to step in and say something at that point? You'll note for next week, Eliphaz in chapter 4. This is the first response to Job, and I just wanted to read this to you quickly because I think there's a really nice segue here. But Eliphaz says in chapter 4, verse 2, if one ventures a word with you, will you be offended? But who can keep from speaking? And I'm going to talk more about this as we get into things next week, but I think that Job's friends get a really bad rap because we read through Job 1 and 2, and then we skip all the way to the end and we read through the divine theophanies where God puts a stamp on Job and says, Job spoke rightly about me and the friends did not speak rightly about me. And we're like, oh, the friends are they're awful comforters. They just don't know what they're doing. They have no ideas as to how to actually be a good comforter. But then I think when you sit and you wrestle with Job really slowly like we're doing, and you hear these words of Job that are implicitly cursing God, and then you see the friends come up and say, are you going to be offended if I say this? I can't help but say something because you've said this about this God that I love and that I care about, and I can't square that. And so this is a question that's posed to the church, I think, at the end of chapter 3 and again at the beginning of chapter 4. What do we do with language like this? And is there a need to defend God? Or can we just let this kind of language stand as is? So this is something for you to wrestle with as part of God's people. Well, we went slightly over time again, and I apologize. But again, this is super intricate and complex Hebrew poetry, and I want to give you guys tools and resources to engage with this, to really sit inside of this and wrestle with it and struggle with it, because this is not just some great theoretical experiment, though we can kind of do that in the space that we have here, but this is also a reality for a lot of people. A lot of people suffer like this, and a lot of people in the church suffer like this. They follow God. They do all of these things. They're saying, I'm living a good and a right life, and then something just comes and smacks them upside the head, and they start suffering, and they say, whoa, why am I suffering like this? Maybe it would just be better for me to say, curse the day of creation, curse the day I was born. There's no possible way I can continue to be faithful, and I can continue to follow a God who would let this happen.
I think, one thing it makes me think about, and I know that the plan of service today was just being in mind, we probably, my experience of the church, which is the American Evangelical Church, we probably have not developed our practice of lament as we should, so that we could join someone in their lament.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the things I think of when you say a person comes in like this. We're so tempted to want to be, to solve things and correct things, but really, probably what a person initially needs is for someone to join them in their lament.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah.
And we ought to know how to do that well.
Right. Well, and I appreciate you making that connection between the Sunday school and between the service, because this morning we are going to have a lament service. Very specifically for those who are in the room and for those who are joining us through the live stream, you get a little bit of background. I'm going to say this in service too, I think, but this past Friday was the official 1-year mark of when we were ordered to go into lockdown and to be in quarantine, and when masks started to be mandated. And so it's been a full year. It's been a full 367 days that we've been in lockdown. And I think that the church is doing a service to absolutely nobody when we just sit here and say, yeah, that's okay. This is just our reality. We're just going to throw our hands up and we're going to accept it. I think our God invites us to engage more with that. He invites us to throw up our hands to him and to say, God, I don't like this. I don't want to do this anymore. This suffering is unwarranted. What did we do to deserve this? Why are you not dealing with this? Where are you inside of all of this? And yeah, Bob, just like what you were saying, I think that by learning to practice and develop our lament, we can better help someone who's sitting in suffering with this.
Yeah, and I realized in my own ministry that as a
Bob, can you come up and speak in one of these? Tara just asked it would help if she could hear the comments. Please and thank you. This one's not working.
Yeah, I was just kind of reflecting and realizing that in my 40 years of ministry, I do look back and realize that the more life I had lived, and the more surprises that had, confronted me and suffering, and difficulty, I did find that when a person came to me, in their suffering, that I began to realize maybe the first best thing I can do is say, oh yes, I've been confronted with, a lot of times it's a family issue. I've had 2 daughters, and boy, I remember a day when we felt so lost, and what to do next, and so that you can enter into that sense of lament with them. But yeah, it does take some experience of life, I guess.
Yeah, well, again, experience of life, but also the community experience of lament, where we lament, we share in each other's sufferings and in each other's burdens. Like, yes, church is a place to come and to be encouraged, but church has also come to place and to share in the sufferings and the burdens of the people in our community. That's what it means that, when we call us the branch family or the branch community, like we're in this together, thick and thin, whatever it might be, like that's what we're here for. It's the same spirit that binds us all together, that gives gifts for the building and uplifting of the church. And part of that uplifting is bearing and carrying each other's burdens and sufferings. So I hope that you will keep this in the back of your mind this morning as we worship together. Lament is an extremely legitimate form of worship, but I hope that you'll keep this in the back of your mind as we worship this morning. But then also come back to this throughout this week and engage with the poem. And again, if you want some tools, there's a Sunday school lesson. I forget exactly when it is. It's in our Sunday school lesson repertoire. It was how to read the Bible on poetry. There are some good skills that you can look at that will help you make connections in different places as well. But thank you all for being here, for being in the room this morning, for joining us through the live stream. We're going to have to cut quick so we can get things ready for service this morning. But if you need to talk to somebody, or you have a question or a comment or something, feel free to send me a text or a quick email, or you can also put it in the comments of this video, and I will see. I probably won't see that as quickly, but I'd love to sit down and talk with you at some point. So thank you for being here this morning, and we'll see you in just a few minutes.